Everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be joining us from today. I know I just said that for those that have been here, but some new people. So thank you for being here. I'm Julie Montgomery, WFN's Director of Membership Strategy and Engagement, based here in Washington, D.C. If you're new to WFN, thank you so much for being here. And to our longtime supporters, champions, and friends, welcome back. We're so glad to have you here with us today. So before we get started, please take a moment to introduce yourself into the chat. Just let us know your name, your organization, and where you're joining us from today. We'd love to see who's here today. And let's see if I can see the chat here. Welcome, Gail from Missouri. So if others are here, please introduce yourself. We'd love to see who else is here from the community. We'd also love to hear more about why you're here today, and what you hope to gain from today's session. So feel free to drop that into the chat as well. Hi, Laura. It's good to see some familiar names. So let us know, why are you here and what do you hope to gain from today's session? That will help us in our facilitated conversations later in the event. So I think we'll go ahead and get started to the next slide. So we're here today with three great speakers, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But I did want to talk a little bit about WFN for those that are not familiar with WFN. We are a growing global community of more than 120 women's funds, foundations, gender equity funders, allies, and individuals. And we have members span over 13 countries, 33 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. And we have one of our Puerto Rico members here today, Veronica. Collectively, our members invest more than 1.4 billion annually to advance gender equity, and we really believe and firmly believe that when you support and invest in gender justice, philanthropic impact becomes stronger, deeper, and more meaningful, and really just makes a difference in gender equity all around the world. And we do this, in close partnership with our members and our partners as well. And really, your commitment, your insight, your support is really what makes our work possible. So thank you. Really, we are truly grateful, and we deeply appreciate the commitment that you make and that you bring each day to advance gender equity all around the world. So over the next hour, you're going to be learning more about how organizations are centering community voice in their grant making and why that matters. And we really hope that you'll leave today's session with new insights and practical tools to help strengthen equity-centered listening in your own organizations and grant-making practices. The way that the event's going to happen today is we're going to have it in three parts. So first, we're going to hear a short presentation from Sachi, followed by a Q&A. And if you have questions for Sachi, please include them in the chat. After that presentation and Q&A, we'll move to a conversation between Veronica and Sachi. Again, we'll have times for questions, so add them to the chat. And then finally, we will be having a facilitated discussion that will be led by Sachi, Veronica, and Heidi. So please stay till the end because we really want to hear your reflection, and it's all about peer learning and sharing. So now I'd like to introduce our three speakers. We have Sachi, Veronica, and Heidi. Thank you for being here, all of you. So Sachi Takahashi Real is the Director of Partner Services at Listen for Good, where she supports philanthropic and nonprofit partners in achieving their strategic goals. Previously, Sachi worked at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, where she coached school and district leaders on using student feedback to strengthen their programs. And as you'll learn, Sachi is an expert on community engagement and feedback. So thank you, Sachi, for taking the time and for really being the main facilitator and moderator for this event today. Next, we have Veronica Colon Rosario. She is a WFN member and board member. Thank you, Veronica. And she's the executive director of Fundación de Mujeres in Puerto Rico, which supports grassroots women-led organizations addressing gender-based violence, economic justice, and community resilience in Puerto Rico. we're very fortunate to have Veronica as a part of our community. She really is a true champion for gender equity and for WFN. So thank you, Veronica. And then last but not least, Heidi Elneal. Thank you, Heidi. Is joining us last minute because our original facilitator was unable to be here, but we're so happy to have you here, Heidi. Heidi is a senior coordinator of partner services at Listen for Good, where she helps organization design and implement sustainable feedback loops. So thank you, Heidi, for being here. Okay, so now that I've introduced these speakers, you're going to hear from them in a second, but just a few quick notes before begin. First, this is being recorded. We're going to share the recording and slides with everyone that registered, and we're going to share the recording publicly. Second, please stay on mute, unless you're speaking, so, there are no distractions. And then I said this earlier, but please post any questions you have in the chat. We'll address them on a first come, first served basis. Hopefully we'll get to all of them in time, but we're not sure based on your questions and limited time. And then finally, before you sign off today, we're going to put the survey link into the chat. Please take a moment to fill that out. It really is important for us. Your feedback really matters and will help us improve our future events. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to turn it over to Sachi. Thank you, Sachi.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Julie. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to what is Listen for Good. And I think that this will be helpful because to give y'all an idea and some context on the experience and the expertise that we're bringing to this conversation. And then I'm really I'm going to share some trends that we've seen across the sector, including for grant makers and for nonprofits, organizations across the social sector. So I'll share a little bit about Listen for Good and then some trends. And then I'm really excited for everyone to be able to hear from Veronica about her experience as a grant maker so that then y'all are hearing from a peer, you can ask questions. So we're excited to share and also learn from you as well. So let me just dive in. Listen for Good is a nonprofit. Our mission and vision is to support social sector organizations to gather actionable community feedback with an equity frame. So whether that's supporting a food bank to get feedback from people receiving food in order to improve services, or whether that's supporting a grant maker to get feedback from grantees or from community in order to improve grant making. Listen for Good has coaching and resources that we provide to organizations because our mission and vision is that we know that in the social sector, our work is most effective if we're centering the voices of those people in our community that are closest to the need. And so we help organizations do that. The way that we do that is following what we frame as a five-step feedback cycle. Our methodology has a survey at the center. And I know that when you think about surveys, sometimes people think, it's multiple choice, it's an email or a text message. We take a broad definition of what is a survey. So I'm going to use the word survey, but sometimes when we're working with organizations, sometimes it looks like a survey or an email. Sometimes it looks like an interview. Sometimes it's in person. Sometimes it's over the phone. Sometimes it's using an iPad. Sometimes it's more like a conversation. So when I say survey, think about it as defining that as getting a broad base of feedback from some audience. And so what Listen for Good resources help organizations do is go through each step in a really good, high quality feedback cycle. The first step is survey design, designing actionable questions. The next step is getting a strong response rate and an unbiased response rate. The third step is analyzing the results. The fourth step is making a change based on what you hear. And then the fifth step is closing the loop, sharing back the results with community. So Listen for Good's resources support organizations in the social sector to do that really well. We've been around since 2016, and since then, we've supported over 1,200 organizations across the country and partnered with 145 foundations across the country. Most often, when we're partnering with organizations, or with foundations, the way that looks is that foundations are supporting their grantee partners to participate in Listen for Good's program and receive Listen for Good's coaching and resources. Like, so for example, the Bar Foundation supported a group of New England nonprofits to participate with Listen for Good. But sometimes, in the case of like the New York Women's Foundation, for example, sometimes foundations are working with Listen for Good to do their own surveying, whether that's a community survey, a grantee survey, a partner survey, etc. And since we've worked with over 1,000 organizations across the country, Listen for Good is actually the largest application of the Net Promoter Score in the social sector. The Net Promoter Score is that recommend question that you see all the time. Would you recommend this product, this service to somebody in a similar situation as you? So, given that experience, the thing that I want to share next is what are some of the challenges that we see that are unique to the social sector in getting really actionable feedback? Feedback that helps grant makers, feedback that helps nonprofits do better. What are some of the barriers and what are some of the solutions? So that's what I'm going to share about next. And the first one that I'll go over is related to trust. And this one is related to power imbalances. Just like there's a power imbalance between grant maker and grantee, there's also a power imbalance between nonprofits and the people that they serve, oftentimes. And so you could see that being, you're giving a grantee survey and asking, how are we doing? Or a food bank is giving a survey to people receiving food and asking, how are we doing? And people saying, you're doing great. Don't change anything. It's all awesome. Everything's good. And we see this, that's called courtesy bias. And that's a normal thing for surveys all over the place. Everybody wants to be, when you're taking a survey, you want to tell somebody what you think they want to hear. But it's even more endemic in the social sector because people who are responding to surveys, because of that power imbalance, may fear retribution based on what they share. So they're more likely to be like, oh, nothing in it for me telling you anything critical. I'm just going to say you're doing everything well. That's one challenge. Another challenge that we see that's even worse in the social sector than other places is survey fatigue. And when I say survey fatigue, I mean respondents getting a lot of surveys and getting a lot of questions in those surveys. Survey fatigue exists everywhere. I can't go to Target without getting a survey or, an airport, a hotel. In the social sector, though, what we see is that, let me give an example, actually. So, say you're running an after-school program. You have government funders that require you to give a certain pre-post survey that's maybe 30 or 50 questions to families. And then you have other funders that are requiring other questions in other surveys. So maybe you've got a pre-post and a midpoint survey. And then you also have your own questions that you want to ask for your own continuous improvement. Where do you put that? So in the social sector, for people who are receiving services from nonprofits and for people who are interacting with funders, that survey fatigue is enhanced. Not just because there's more questions, because there's different requirements coming from a lot of different places, but also because oftentimes those questions aren't actionable for the body that's giving them. So there isn't a response that goes back to the community afterwards saying, here's what you said, here's what we did with it. Your voice actually led to change. And that's because of this third barrier, which is related to really extractive feedback practices in the social sector. Because what we see is that nonprofits are often making choices, uh, strategic choices, decisions, programmatic choices, not based on the needs of the people that they serve, but based on other really important stakeholders. That could be their funders, that could be their board, that could be their leadership. It's really hard to put community needs alongside these other important factors, especially when funding is at stake. So, for nonprofits that are making decisions, um, again, Listen for Good's mission and vision is that community voice is one of the most important voices at the table as folks are making decisions. But oftentimes that's not the case. Somebody will take a survey and not see any results come back or not see any change. And that's when people check out from processes. And that's grantees as well as community members in the social sector. Okay, those are tough. Those are tough challenges. Um, Let's go to solutions. What does Listen for Good seen? How can we do better? The first barrier that I mentioned was trust related to power imbalances. And the best way to break down power imbalances is to shift power to community. This visual, which is a lot, I know there's a lot of words here. This visual that I'm showing here is what Listen for Good calls our client engagement pyramid. And basically, what this is meant to show is that there's a base or a foundation of getting a broad base of feedback from community, hearing from as many people as possible, from as many segments as possible. And there are actions that organizations can take to build on that in order to engage a smaller group of constituents in more active co-creation and ownership of strategy. So ways that Listen for Good has seen this work in the social sector include advisory boards, whether that's of clients or of grantees, more leadership opportunities for clients or for grantees, and a lot of the tricky thing that I brought up before was like, people are going to fill out your surveys and be like, everything's great, don't change anything. But if you can show someone that you're working with community, even better if a community member that looks like them is the one sharing with them, hey, we want your feedback. We want your really honest feedback. I'm going to be in the room using those responses and hearing your voice and making changes based on what you say. Here's why we want you to be really honest and critical with us. That's when you get the most unbiased response. The other, the other barrier that I mentioned was survey fatigue. And I won't say that there's a silver bullet here, but what Listen for Good has seen is that a surefire way to increase response rates and to decrease bias in responses is to close the loop with community. Let folks know, here's what you've said in the past, here's what we did as a result. We want your feedback again. But we're actually using it. Because survey fatigue comes from not just the amount of surveying, but from the feeling that you're screaming into a black hole and nobody's listening. So I'm going to give a funny example. This is a company, right? So this is a couple of years ago. Skittles did this like marketing campaign about how Lime is back. We're sorry we took it away. I don't know what they did with Lime, but apparently they brought it back. Um, and this is, and I share this because Listen for Good's coaches are constantly sharing with organizations what are some creative ways that you can share back with your community how you've heard from them in the past and what you've done. Because the more that you're able to show people we're listening, this feedback loop is ongoing. And not just, it's not enough to just do the response. You have to tell people, you have to communicate it really well and let them know here's what you said, here's what we did. Your feedback didn't go into a black hole. The last example that I'm going to give related to this last barrier is how one organization and their funders were responsive to community voice in order to break down that challenge of extractive feedback practices. So Habitat for Humanity of Greater Memphis, one of the services that they provide is it's like home improvements to help older adults age in place. So ramps, grab bars, installing these home improvements. And so they asked seniors who are receiving these improvements, how is this working for you? And they heard two things. One was, this is great. This is helping me stay in my home. Thank you so much. And they also heard, there's one thing that you put in my house that I don't know how to use. That's not helpful to me. And so what Habitat did with that feedback was take it to their leadership, take it to their board, take it to their funders to be able to say, this program is working and it can be even better. It can be more effective and we can scale it more effectively if we have a half-time social worker to help older adults use the more complicated home improvements that we're installing. And funders, in that case, use that feedback. They were responsive to community needs and to the organization and funded that additional staff member. So again, this is breaking that like extractive cycle of how feedback can get stuck at a certain place. It doesn't get stuck if organizations are responsive and they say this is who we're centering when we're making decisions, and if funders are responsive to those community needs. If they're asking their grantee partners, who are you hearing from? What are they saying? How can we help? So here's a couple other things that Listen for Good has seen in terms of trends in how grant makers are using that community feedback and partnering with nonprofits with their grantees, with their nonprofit partners, in order to hear from community and use community voice. One of the reasons that we found that grant makers find this so important is because the better data nonprofits have, the better data grant makers have. Oftentimes, funders are asking their grantees for impact metrics. They're like, how are you doing? Where are our dollars going? What can we tell our board and our donors? Um, and if nonprofits have biased data or bad response rates or extractive feedback practices, that's worse data that's going to them for their own continuous improvement and it's also worse data for grant makers. So what we see for why feedback and community voice is so important and really good practices are really important in the nonprofit sector is also for grant makers, and especially data on squishier metrics that are harder to measure, like relationships, like confidence, like trust. These are things that surveys are actually pretty good at getting at. One other example that I'll share is related to so grant makers often want to use community feedback in order to inform their grant making, but they don't have that direct relationship with community. Nonprofits are trusted institutions in their communities, and foundations are often one step further removed. So what we often see is foundations partnering with their nonprofit partners to ask, what are you hearing and how can we be responsive? One example that I'll share is from a foundation in Texas that supported a group of health clinics to get feedback from their patients. And what these health clinics heard was that transportation was the biggest barrier to patients accessing health services. And so that was an aha moment for this foundation because they're a health funder, not a transportation funder, but they're actually in the best position to support changes, policy, coalitions related to the transportation piece more so than the clinics themselves. So as a grant maker, that was an aha moment to say, how can we make our grant making more effective to improve health access through this lens, through this finding from health clinics, what they heard from community. And the last thing that I'll share before we go to questions, actually, this is my last slide, is what are we seeing in this moment? Listen for Good works with hundreds of nonprofits every year. 2025 and 2026 are an unprecedented moment in our sector. Um, what we're seeing right now is that data is still important for nonprofits, for sector leaders. It is a time of uncertainty, but people have to make decisions based on something. And oftentimes, and what we're seeing is for organizations that are able to center community voice in that strategic decision making, they're coming out more resilient. So as an example, nonprofits are making tough choices right now maybe about changing their decreasing hours, decreasing programs. Um, when they're centering the voice of their community, centering the voice of their staff members that are interacting with community every day, they're able to make decisions like that sometimes are surprising. Like we've worked with one organization that was surprised to find that when they asked their community what hours are most important to you, because we're going to have to make changes here based on funding, people said we want more morning hours. The organization was like, "Oh, we would have thought it was going to be evening hours." But okay, good, good. We can make changes to be resilient and be responsive to your needs as we go forward in this time of uncertainty. So that's a lot of what Listen for Good is seeing right now. Data is important in order to make those decisions, especially those tough decisions, to be resilient in this moment. And so we have a few, we're going to do a quick pause for questions, if there's any questions based on what I've shared. And then I'm excited to hear from Veronica and we'll go there next. But Julie, maybe can I tap you to
Yeah.
see if there's been any questions in the chat?
Yeah, we had one question from Anab Mohammed. Uh, to what extent does survey fatigue affect, influence data collection or insight interpretation?
Mm, I guess maybe. maybe I have a clarifying question for the person asking. What,
Anab, yeah.
yeah, what's behind your question? I'm curious to hear more.
Anab, would you like to say more? You can come off mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I guess the reason behind my question is that there tends to be more emphasis on data collection tools and methodologies, and I guess that the reason behind my question is that there tends to be more emphasis towards the I guess more sort of like a distrust, not necessarily a distrust of quantitative I mean like qualitative data and stories that come from communities. There's more attention is being given towards like numbers, and so I guess there's more insight that can be gained from stories and for the perspectives of communities, and unfortunately that hasn't necessarily gained a lot of traction. And so I feel like maybe that's just kind of like, because I come from the perspective of leaning more towards community input and community insights, and so I feel like um um maybe survey fatigue might be like related to that. So the choice of the methodology behind data collection, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm,
Hope that
mm-hmm.
clarifies
Yeah,
that
it's such a good
question.
point.
Thank
The
you.
Let me share one thing that I think might be helpful, and this is related, but not necessarily, I think that what you've shared is really important. And one of the things when Listen for Good is working with organizations and they ask like, what methodology should we be using? Where do focus groups fit in? Where do interviews fit in? Community town halls. Like there are a lot of different ways of getting feedback. What we always recommend is getting that broad base of feedback first, and as a necessary like as something that's necessary, because oftentimes as a funder, as an organization, as a leader, who you hear from is pretty predictable. You're going to hear from the loudest people who are just always loud. And oftentimes they're loud because they expect to be heard. And sometimes that comes from privilege. So you're always going to hear from loud people. You're always going to hear from your happiest people, the people who are the biggest champions of your work. They love what you do no matter what you do. And you're always going to hear from the least happy people that are just like always mad. They're so grumpy, like that they're mad and they're going to let you know about it. There are three groups you're always going to hear from no matter what, even if you're not soliciting their feedback. So for us, our recommendation is always to get that broad base of feedback so that you have an idea how representative those voices are. Otherwise, it could be really easy to index on the really happy people or the really unhappy people or the really loud people. But a broad base of feedback will let you know, are different people having different experiences with our organization? Like, are BIPOC-led organizations having a different experience than white-led organizations as grantees? So getting that broad base of feedback and then narrowing to focus groups and interviews and other types and other methodology, like other storytelling methodologies, as you find out, oh, okay, well, there's this theme that we want to learn more about from BIPOC-led organizations that are grantee partners or partners in the community. So let's do a focus group or let's do a series of interviews with that group. So that's very methodology heavy, but I think in line with what you're sharing on like surveys are not the only way of getting feedback. There are other important uh, layers and complements too.
All right, thank you.
Great. Thanks. So we have one more question from Stacy. How do you respond to perspectives from board or executives about any potential gaps from community survey respondent voices when it comes to action from the results?
And Stacey, do you mean when you're talking about gaps, do you mean like gaps in the organization's ability to take action on the results?
It dovetails a little bit with how you just responded, and I appreciate the other ways to gather that feedback. I think it's really looking at, data and understanding if you're moving towards a decision, how do you speak to the voices that may not have been able to lean in and offer their perspective.
Yeah, yeah. That is a tricky one. A lot of Listen for Good's work. I think one of the hardest things that we see in the social sector, so not a barrier that I mentioned, but a very persistent one, is how do you get feedback from voices least heard, people that are the least likely to give you to share with you. And that might be because historically they haven't been listened to, or that might be because it's logistically more difficult to get their feedback. Yeah, maybe it's more difficult to get their feedback because they speak a different language, because they don't have a written language, because, there could be because, technology fluency is like there's a million reasons that it could be very difficult to hear from a particular population. What Listen for Good always recommends is that you try to oversample those communities because you're probably not going to, if you looked at your population and you're like, 10% falls into this bucket that is like hard for us to hear from, you're probably not going to get to 10% of our responses are from these people. So oversampling those groups is always really important. And being willing to dedicate more resources to getting those responses because it probably is going to be more difficult. It might take more partnership with other organizations. It might take more investment in time, in maybe that's volunteers, maybe that's staff, maybe that's incentives, being willing and able to compensate people for their time, giving their feedback. So one of the big recommendations that we have is trying to get as representative of a response rate as possible. But I think to your question also about like, what about, you get the results back, you're sharing them with your leadership, and there is a gap there. Um, I think the important thing to be able to say is, here's what we tried, here's who we heard from, here's the depth of here's the trend that we noticed, whether there's a difference or not, and whether or not that difference is something that you want to follow up on. And so making it clear to leadership and board why a population is a priority, investing as much as possible in getting a strong response rate from that group. And then when sharing the results, being able to say, here are the differences that we saw or didn't see for what they said and how we recommend responding to that. But Stacey, does
Thank
that get to
you.
your question?
Yeah, that's great insights. Appreciate it.
Okay, great.
Great suggestions.
Thanks
Okay,
so much for the
yeah,
questions. Well, I'm going to keep us moving because I know that everyone wants to hear from Veronica as well. Julie, can you do the cool configuration of the screen where where Veronica's here too?
trying to do that right now. Sorry about that. But
Cool. No,
I
that's
see
great.
Veronica. I see Veronica, and does everyone else see Veronica and Sachi?
I believe each person has access to view it as they want to.
Okay, good. Well, I'll get us started then, and then as folks, I want to make sure that everybody can see Veronica as I'm asking questions. But Veronica, maybe we can just kick off. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the foundation, in general, and then also just share what was the impetus for your feedback project.
Hi, everybody. It's so happy to be here and lovely to see some familiar names and faces. Those of you that I can see your face in the screen. The Fundación de Mujeres in Puerto Rico, it's the only philanthropic organization in the archipelago that funds gender justice intentionally. So that's the only thing. I mean, we do gender and racial justice because we're in Puerto Rico. It's something that it's oh, there I am. So we are a relatively new fund. We're a women's fund. We're relatively new. We launched here in Puerto Rico in 2020. Um, and we've been working, obviously, because of the situation in Puerto Rico, we've been working mostly with emergency funding. And as you know, many of you know, women's funds are experts in emergency situations. We're really good at disbursing money during crisis, and also we are in solidarity with our grantee partners. So our foundation, it's small, it's not a big fund. As I mentioned, we are starting, we're still fundraising to reach the budget that we want, but we have challenges, of course. Considering all the challenges that we all have right now, Puerto Rico is in a very particular situation, and this has to do a little bit of why we did this project with Listen for Good. Um, uh, Puerto Rico is kind of in the limbo in terms of philanthropic investment. We are not seen by foundations in the U.S. as a place to fund because of our territorial status. There is a lot of confusion of whether we are a U.S. or Latin America, or like if they are taking a political stance if they fund us in either portfolio. So part of my job and something I did not expect to be doing in this position is an advocate to funding in Puerto Rico. And for that, I need data. And data in Puerto Rico is not something that it's so easy to access. A lot of the research in the US either excludes Puerto Rico or doesn't really go into detail about the particular situation in Puerto Rico. And if you look at the data, which is my goal to be able to show this, we are one of the most severely underfunded regions in all the US. And I'm not talking internationally for this conference because we do not qualify for international funding. So we're in a very delicate situation. And when you talk about gender justice funding, the funding is already limited. So to talk about more limitations can be challenges for many of the organizations. So there was the founders saw a need to start this foundation because of that, because we are prone to crisis, because we are in the climate change vulnerable zone. We're going to keep seeing emergency, and who gets affected the most? It's women, girls, and the LGBTQ community. And who are the ones responding to emergencies is the same people who are going through the emergency. So this opportunity was offered by a funder, and I saw it, and they asked me if I was interested. I said absolutely yes. I saw a great opportunity to explore something that I've been wondering for a long time, like what's the level of investment for gender justice work here in Puerto Rico, and the intentionality behind it. So the impetus for this project was the need to understand how foundations in Puerto Rico are incorporating gender equity into their funding strategy. So we know gender-based work here is critical because of the levels of gender-based violence in Puerto Rico, to the point that we had to declare a state of emergency. So it's critical, yet there's limited data on how philanthropy as a sector is addressing this issue. So we decided to participate with Listen for Good to strengthen our learning practices and centering the voices of our peer philanthropic institutions in the ecosystem in Puerto Rico. We focus in foundations that give in Puerto Rico. So that's obvious, but I just wanted to mention it. And we aim to move beyond assumptions, because we have our hypothesis, we have our assumptions, but it's always better to gather direct information and structured feedback from foundations to understand what the barriers are, the opportunities, and the perceptions around gender inclusion in funding.
Mm-hmm. So who did you hear from? What did you learn, and what challenges, what was hard along the way?
So I'm going to start with the challenges because that's related of who we heard from. One of the main challenges is something that you already discussed in your introduction, was engaging busy foundation leaders in ensuring survey participation. It was a short outreach window. And while we partner with a local organization called Filantropía Puerto Rico, is the local philanthropic serving institution. It's called Filantropía Puerto Rico, to support recruitment and, of course, credibility, because this is the organization that gathers all the foundations in Puerto Rico. We still needed to do follow-ups and outreach calls, and Filantropía Puerto Rico has a policy of not sharing contacts, which I'm still fighting to change. So they don't share contacts, and it was really hard for us to do this in that way. So that was something that I wish I had thought of before. Having this agreement with Filantropia before going into the research. So another challenge was designing the questions, because gender justice is such a it's a very it can be a sensitive topic for some people, particularly for organizations who yet don't prioritize it. So we have to frame the questions in a non-judgmental and invitational way. Luckily, and we also wanted to make it short, but at the same time gather important data. So that's always a challenge for everybody. Fortunately, we had a really good mentor from Listen for Good who helped us with the questions. Because if it was left to me, I would be like, okay, I think this is the question, but Listen for Good, it's really good for organizations like mine. I don't have a full-time research person in staff, so this was perfect. So we learned a great deal, even though we received I think I will get you the end later. I will get you the number of how many people responded, but we received very interesting feedback from across all foundations. A few said that gender inclusion is central to our strategy, while others indicated that it's only occasionally considered or not prioritized at all. Now, if you divide US funders and Puerto Rico funders, it was the US funders that prioritize it. In Puerto Rico, it's not a priority. And in fact, none of the foundations in Puerto Rico have a gender program. They go after gender funding when there is something that attracts, when there is a trend, but they don't really have they only give gender justice funding when there is money in some of their programs. So I found that it's a small project inside some of their programmatic areas. So we saw a significant variation in investment levels. Other ones can fund a lot, others are very limited. And there are a lot of barriers, such as lack of understanding, limited data on impact, and misalignment with organizational priorities, and insufficient leadership buy-in. So you can have a CEO or executive director that is completely interested in doing this, but the board is still in the conservative side, a little bit afraid of jumping into this, particularly in LGBTQ issues. So that was, I needed that information, because that helps me build my value added in Puerto Rico, right? So that means that I am really the one going for these leaders and fighting for these leaders. And I need to build a strategy to support other foundations in Puerto Rico to build gender justice, because I don't want to be the only one funding gender justice in Puerto Rico. So, and there is a strong interest among some of the foundations in receiving guidance and resources. So we're working on that. And so overall, we learned that while there's openness to gender inclusion, there's also a need to do some capacity building with them, give them better data, and a stronger sector-wide alignment.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like a lot of like you had an inkling going in that of what you would find, and the results were affirming, and not only affirming of what you thought that you would find, but then also actionable for you to support other foundations, and then also to share and advocate for the sector. So I'm excited for you to share more about how did you use the data, and who did you share the results with?
So initially, this was always going to be for us to understand. So if I'm going to go outside of Puerto Rico and advocate for my people and for gender justice work here in Puerto Rico, I need to understand who else is doing it, because other funders are going to ask me, like, who else in Puerto Rico is working on this? And I've had funders ask me, this foundation asked for money for reproductive justice. Like, where are you in this equation? And I'm like, Yeah, there needs to be an alignment between philanthropic organizations in Puerto Rico in terms of these issues. But I do need to know who is working on this, so I go informed to my spaces. So it's being used to map the current landscape of gender equity in philanthropy here in Puerto Rico and to identify what gaps and opportunities there are for intervention. So it informs our strategy around advocacy, partnership building, and resource development in the sector. So we committed to sharing a summary of finding, and we did share the summary of findings among the participants, but not only the participants, but everybody within the group of Filantropía Puerto Rico. And then we did a podcast with them talking about the results. And I drafted a guide to how to do how to fund with a gender lens. Who is using it? I'm still working on finding out who is using it and how it has worked. But we're working with Filantropía Puerto Rico to build programs to help other funders understand what is gender lens, because some of them think that, oh, I'm funding this organization that has a woman in leadership, and they think that's gender justice, and the organization may or may not be supporting women, girls, and the LGBT community, or they may be working with housing mostly with men. So that is not necessarily a gender lens approach. I apologize for my dog in the background. So they were used internally by our foundation to refine not our programming, because we have a very lean operational model. We're a funder, we're pass through, and we're also a funder. But it helps us to have external conversations, informed conversations with partners like Filantropía Puerto Rico and other stakeholders in the philanthropic ecosystem here.
Mhm. And this is my last question for Veronica, so y'all get your questions ready in the chat. What's next? Where is this project going?
So Filantropía Puerto Rico is now developing this database about organizations in Puerto Rico, about the whole ecosystem. And they just launched that tool last week, and I was in that meeting. And of course, I came with all the questions, and I came with questions based on these results. And I pointed out none of the data is segmented into genders. So gender is conglomerated under human rights, like in many other platforms, it doesn't tell you anything about who is funding and how they're funding gender justice in Puerto Rico. So I'm trying to work with them into refining that data, and they are very, very, very open to listening to my feedback. And I think I'm going to be in the advisory committee for that, which is very exciting, because then it is an opportunity to continue this work and focus in specific information about how to integrate gender equity into their funding strategy. So what tools we can develop with this information. So we also want to create learning opportunities for them, dialogue with the philanthropic sector. We use the findings to advocate for increased and more strategic investments in gender justice and gender equity initiatives here in Puerto Rico, and continue building a strong evidence base on gender equity in Puerto Rico to address, not just the lack of funding, but the lack of data. So it's a starting point. This project was a starting point based on it was for the deeper engagement with the sector and a step forward towards shifting philanthropic practices here in Puerto Rico. So it was very, very informative, and it has definitely moved some things forward here.
Super helpful. And there has been one question in the chat, so we'll start with that, and other folks can chat in as well. One person asked, have you already reached out to the Hispanic Federation as a potential partner in this work?
Yes, the Hispanic Federation is inside Filantropía Puerto Rico, and I don't think they answered the survey. And they don't have a gender program here. They have a reproductive justice project, but they don't have a specific that I know of. They don't have a specific, unless something happened in the last few months, they don't have a specific gender program.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. A lot of my share was about community surveys or program participant surveys or hearing from grantees. Veronica shared about a peer survey where she was learning about the landscape and gathering data on the landscape of funding to be able to advocate. What is this? What else does this bring up for folks? Questions for Veronica?
I like to think that I was so clear that nobody has any questions. I'm happy to answer. I mean, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn about the experience. There's so much more. I can also share with you the results. They're not secret. We believe in transparency. I see Corrine Jocelyn. Hi, Corrine. So happy to see you. So we're happy to share results and the experience. I think everybody should do if you're doing this work in a specific region, especially if it's challenging in terms of philanthropic fundraising and investment in a particular issue. Gender justice is always complicated. LGBTQ issues are always complicated, and now race issues are also complicated. So we have to know what we are doing. We have to know who is with us and who is partnering with us, and how we can change that to better invest in the work that we're doing. Because in Puerto Rico, like in many of your states, this is a life or death initiative. Like women here machismo is real here. We have horrible numbers on domestic violence, gender-based violence, and feminicides. So with a state of emergency, I'm still surprised that we are not gathering the data that we need to address these issues, because it intersects with all the work that everybody does. It doesn't matter if you do cultural work, if you do arts, if you do political work, especially political work, and if you do education, if you don't look into the gender data or how you are looking at the intersections of gender and race, you might just be not having the results that you are really expecting. You have to really look at that for any of the funding that you do.
Well, thank you so much, Veronica, for that insight. I imagine that that folks will take you up on your offer to connect, and
Yeah,
that
I
more
see my
questions might be
LinkedIn. I see
simmering.
my LinkedIn.
Popping up, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, perfect. Let's our team is excited to learn, our group is excited to learn from the audience here as well. I'm gonna put two questions in the chat, and these are questions that I want folks to take 30 seconds to think about internally and then answer one. You can do that in the chat, or you can come off mute and share if you're feeling brave. But take 30 seconds and consider which one of these do you want to answer, and what is your where are you coming from today?
This is for everybody, correct?
For everybody, yeah.
And I have a question there from Magali Cajigas. Magali, I'm sorry if I pronounce your last name wrong. You can correct me. Cajigas.
Lo dijiste bien.
Qué bueno. Gracias. So we have good connections with congressional leaders in New York.
Okay.
In Puerto Rico, we have less allies this year. We lost a lot of them last year with the elections, and like the US, we have a very strong conservative fundamentalist legislator. So it doesn't mean that it's impossible. There are people who are willing to discuss things, especially if you make agreements. But I think right now, a lot of the strategy, like many of you know so well, the strategy has changed.
Only because I asked the question, and I also asked the question about the federation, because I was the former state director for Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, we used to take some of our nonprofits to DC to do congressional visits and do
Mm-hmm.
advocacy pitches and all of that stuff. So here in Connecticut, we have a large Puerto Rican population, Latino population, um, the LGBTQ population. So
Mm-hmm.
all of our pride centers, funding has been affected federally, statewide, all of it, the whole gamut. So definitely a lot of this is resonating with me, and it just makes me think about some of the Connecticut leaders that we have
Mm-hmm.
in DC, Rosa
Yeah.
Laurel, Blumenthal, Chris Murphy. So that I will probably hit you up on LinkedIn, and I still have some of those connections, so that if you
Yeah.
want an email introduction or anything like that, if that's of any help to the cause, I'd be more than happy
That's
to do that.
wonderful. Thank you. I'm also including my email here in the chat, and so we can, because we don't
Okay.
want to monopolize the conversation, but I'm more than happy to continue the conversation with you.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
thank you for that, Magali.
Of course.
Gracias.
And all of it, everything that y'all are saying, this this moment makes this work even more important to be able to center community voice, to be able to translate to leaders, whether that's elected, et cetera, what we're hearing and advocate for our communities is even more important. Any thoughts on before so we have just a couple minutes left. Does anybody have answers to question one or two? Feel free to chat them in or come off mute and let us know. Oh, good. Exciting. One comment about intentional community gathering and connecting, especially for rural grantees. Does anybody have a thought that I know that sometimes writing can be, you want to make your writing perfect, but we don't have that much time. Does anybody even have like a half-formed thought that they want to come off mute and share? And it's okay if it's not the most eloquent thing that you've ever said. We're excited to learn from y'all.
I'll answer question two. Karen Johnson from the Haitian Women's Collective. I think for in terms of the compelling reason, it's like oftentimes local women-led organizations in Haiti, those women are hardly ever listened to or brought to the table or asked for their opinion in terms of process of how to do things. They're often kind of given the project to do, or here's how we best think it's going to work. So listening to them, has informed our strategic plan. It's informed kind of how we're doing grant making. It's informed, when we do something they don't like, they tell us, oh, that we should be doing it a little bit different. This is not exactly the way it works here in the city, or where it is a little bit more rural or, really rural. So all of that allows us to work better. I think some of the barriers are often about, the time that it takes, right, to be open and to listen and to gather that information. So again, even with question one around the listening effort, it's putting aside time to be able to do that in a good way.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Karine. I think that that's the perfect that's a really good why and a really good sentiment that we can all get behind to end on. And I want to pass it over to Julie. I'll put up one last slide with contact information, but pass it over to Julie to close us out.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sachi. Thank you, Veronica. This is really incredible. And thank you for sharing your expertise and experience today. And thank you to all the members and the non-members as well. We hope that you'll consider joining WFN. And we hope to see you at our next WFN virtual member only event. That is happening on May 7th, where we're going to be focusing on WFN's intersectionality tool, Data Woven, which our colleague here, well, she was on the line today, Sarah, who will be talking and sharing more about how to use that tool. We will also be announcing the date of our in-person WFN Summit happening this fall. So make sure that you are subscribed to our newsletter, follow us on social media. And then finally, before you go, please make sure to fill out the short survey. We will put that in the link. Your input, again, it really makes a difference and helps us to grow and improve these sessions. So thank you again for being here. We're so grateful for you and all your commitment to gender equity. Thank you, Sachi. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Heidi. And I hope to see you all at a future event. So thank you and have a great afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you might be. Bye, everyone.